This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app or join our emailing list at coldwarconversations.com. Denmark joined NATO as a founding member in 1949. However, it originally laid down limitations to its NATO membership. There were three conditions: no non-Danish bases, no nuclear warheads, and no Allied military activity on Danish territory, although joint exercises were permitted. Bo Hermansen served in a conscript reconnaissance platoon of the Danish Jutland Dragoon Regiment during the 1980s. His squadron was part of the divisional reconnaissance for the Danish Jutland Division, which was tasked to move into the north of West Germany and link up with West German units to stop a Warsaw Pact advance into Jutland. Bo describes Denmark's political stance during this period, where the election of President Reagan in the US and his policies regarding defence caused some concern in Denmark and elsewhere in Europe. We hear of Bo's unit's tactics against the Warsaw Pact, the exercises he participated in, the rivalry between units, and why a Danish tank was painted pink. I'm delighted to welcome Bo Hermansen to our Cold War conversation.
Denmark was geographically placed right dab in the middle of the Baltic, and basically was able to be a stopgap for the Russian, especially the Navy's ability to break out into the Atlantic Ocean. So therefore, Denmark had a very important strategic and also geographic position, because we were actually able to shut down the Soviet Baltic fleet, because if Denmark did what we were supposed to do, it just stayed in harbor. It couldn't go out. So, and I think that the political situation in Denmark, especially in the 80s, Denmark politically were, compared to especially America and also a lot of European nations, we were, I would say, pretty left-wing, so to speak. There were a lot of people who, let's say, didn't like NATO, didn't like America. And in Denmark, there were particularly a movement that kind of were upset with the Americans that they elected Ronald Reagan as president. So that kind of became a point of discussion about how much Denmark should do and not do.
We'll come on to certainly a family discussion that you had about your service in the Danish Army. So as far as the Danish military are concerned, there's the Danish Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and also the Home Guard is a fourth arm of the Danish Army.
And also another thing, we also had a quite large civilian defense. I think in order to get things into perspective, the population of Denmark were about 5 million people, and the Home Guard were quite large. I think something like, when it was biggest, 74,000 members, which is about 1.5%. And the civilian defense units were about something like, I think, over 100,000 people who would be able to provide emergency hospitals. They would provide shelter and food for people who were, let's say, displaced and stuff like that. All the way through the Cold War, there was a great will in Denmark to defend ourselves. But in the 80s, it got a bit hinky with some people. Let's put it like that.
The Danish Army wasn't a solely professional army. The Denmark operated conscription.
Up until, I think, 2005 or something like that, the Danish Army were basically a conscript army. We had some professionals, some units, for example, tanks and other special areas were not conscripts. Those were only professional soldiers. But basically the main part of the army, and especially if Denmark ever went to war, the biggest part would be conscript called up from reserve.
And you were conscripted into the Danish Army. Can you just explain how that conscription system worked?
Yeah, it's basically like a lottery. When you're 18, you're called to this draft board, and you pull a number out of the big lottery. And if you get a number below a certain number, I think around the time when I was doing it, it was maybe around 10,000. So if you pull the number below that, you would be called in. Also, if you had special skills, if you were, let's say, a mechanic, a car mechanic or a truck mechanic, you would be there was a greater chance that you would be pulled, no matter, you would be drafted, no matter how low your number would be or how high it would be. Also for the Navy, they also took butchers and bakers, because they had to make sure that they ate well on their ships, stuff like that. I drew a very high number, I think 34,000. So I was told, you're not going with that number. But you could also then you could also volunteer. So take your national service voluntarily. That gave you the advantage that you could choose where you wanted to serve. And that's what I did. I volunteered to be a conscript, and then I was able to choose to serve at the Jutland Dragoons.
Why the Jutland Dragoons? Why did you choose them?
To be brutal honest, I just thought it sounded cool back then. I was pretty clueless about being a real soldier. I knew they had tanks, and I kind of hoped that I could maybe drive tanks. But basically, I just thought it sounded very cool. So that's basically why I chose it. And that's a decision I have never regretted.
It does sound like a cool unit, the Dragoons. It does sound a bit 18th century, though, I think.
Yeah, we are. Dragoons are basically infantry mounted on horses. That's how we were back in the days. And nowadays, or at least during the Cold War, the old cavalry regiments were the ones who, most of them, fielded most of the tank units in Denmark, and also a lot of the reconnaissance unit. But of course, other infantry regiments also had tank squadrons here and there. We might get back to that when we talk about the Danish Army, perhaps a little bit later, how they were organized and stuff like that.
Sure. And what did your parents think about you volunteering?
Let's say my dad thought it was a great idea. My mom was not so hooked on it because I'm guessing what you're hinting at here is my mother was actually a part of the Danish peace movement. Like all other countries in Europe back then, there was a huge left-wing peace movement, which has given grounds for, let's say, a lot of family discussions during the years, because here we have this guy going into the military. His role back then would be going down to Germany and defending down there. And in the meantime, his mother was a part of the peace movement, who were kind of working against NATO and actually kind of covertly working with the Soviet Union. So that has since then given time for lots of discussions in the family.
Yeah, I can imagine the discussions were probably quite lively. Is your mother a pacifist, or was she purely against the use of nuclear weapons?
I think a combination. I think she's kind of one of those people who say that can we all just get along? And I also think that her involvement she was probably more anti-American than she was anti-Danish. I had this strong feeling that she really disliked Ronald Reagan. And so did a lot of other Danes, actually, back then, especially some of the left-wing politicians. They kind of took it as a personal insult that the Americans actually dared to elect Ronald Reagan. Also, I think another thing was this is also when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister in England. And I know that she really, really disliked her as well. So she just was pretty much left-wing, that's for sure.
And what was your role in the Dragoons?
The first day I started, when you arrive at the barracks, you're absolutely clueless to what's going to happen. So we were actually pulled aside by a couple of non-commissioned officers and said, go with that guy. Go over to the elite, he said. I remember that quite clearly. And then I was followed from where the induction point to the barracks that we were supposed to stay in. And I asked the other sergeant, excuse me, what did he mean by that? And then he said, that means you'll go to the reconnaissance in 3 months. And I was just thinking, reconnaissance, what the hell is that? And then I found out that we actually started in the 2nd battalion, the 2nd Armored Battalion of the Jutland Dragoons, which is an armor battalion. We started in their headquarter and support company and did our recruit training there. And after 3 months, we were actually transferred to a reconnaissance squadron that were professional guys. And at the time, they had made the decision that we would be the last conscripted reconnaissance platoon by the Dragoons. After that, they would turn over and use only professionals in the reconnaissance squadrons.
And what did the professional guys think about, I don't know, you amateurs turning up and being part of the unit?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. We were blessed in my platoon because we had a brilliant platoon commander. I think he was number 1 at the officers' school. And we had some very good sergeants in our platoons. The Danish Army don't use the same system as you see in England, where people slowly advance to the ranks and then they do junior break-in and senior break-in and so forth. In Denmark, you are selected after 3 months. You're selected to go to either sergeant school or military police school. And our sergeant had started 1 year before us, got selected for sergeant school, went there and got back to the regiment, and then they were ready for a new batch. And we had some very, very good sergeants in our platoon, and kind of made sure that in the beginning, these professional guys were kind of apprehensive about these amateurs, so to speak. But I had been told later that as the time went on, through our 9 months of service in the squadron, we kind of got this kind of, we got the silent nod, so to speak, saying that even though for conscript, they're doing pretty okay.
How was the training? Did you find it tough going, coming from a civilian background?
Absolutely. I was, like I said, totally clueless on what was going to happen. I found it particularly hard, especially all the physical stuff. Also, it was kind of a cultural shock. Back then in the 80s, the kind of way you talk to people were quite not so formal. But when you went in and became a recruit, suddenly things got very formal. I don't know if there's a distinction in the British language, but like you say in German, there's a distinction between if you're using the word sie or du. I don't know if the British language has this
no,
two different
there
ways.
A formal and informal.
No, right.
It's just you.
Exactly. But in the Danish Army back then, it was normal to be informal in just about everywhere. But as a recruit, it was very formal. It was a kind of a cultural shock to have to use this kind of outdated language that nobody used anymore. I found that hard, the physical stuff. But now that I look back at it, I'm blessed because some of the lessons that I have applied in my civilian life ever since then, I learned as a recruit by the sergeants in our platoon because they were very good, indeed.
How long did it take you to be trained and then be operational? How long was that period?
The whole mine, I served for 12 months. The first 3 were recruit training, which were done in this headquarter and support squadron. And that was, all the basic soldier stuff, physical stuff, using the rifle. I think the only weapons we were trained on was the M72 light anti-tank rocket, and also anti-tank mines and stuff like that, and a lot of NBC, first aid, a lot of aircraft and tank recognition and stuff like that. And that takes about 3 months. And then you are sent on an exercise that lasts 1 week, where you walk a lot and do a lot of physical stuff. And it's kind of an exam on what you have learned in those 3 months. And for our purpose in my platoon, who were going to the Reconnaissance Squadron, after we were done, when we came back to the barracks on the last day, I distinctly remember this is one of the proudest moments in my life. When our squad sergeant, who later became my squad commander when we were doing reconnaissance, he was called, his name was Sergeant Thompson. And he came to, after we were in the yard, and he kind of said, at ease. And then he went to each of us, shook our hands and said, congratulations, Dragoon. Now you have graduated. Now you are Dragoons. It was a very proud moment, and I will cherish it until the day I die. So that was the first 3 months. Then we got our normal headgear. Back then was a black beret we had in the Danish Army, and in the regiment they had a bronze beret badge. But the reconnaissance, they use a silver badge. But you don't get that until you graduate from basic training. So we also got that, and we got the squadron patch to sew on to our uniforms and all that. And then we were part of the first reconnaissance squadron.
Wow. No, I can imagine that moment where your commanding officer shakes your hands and says you're now a dragoon is a proud moment after you've been through all that training.
It was actually my squad sergeant, the one who was a squad commander during basic training, and he also, by my luck, became the squad leader of the squad that I was in. And just as a momentum, today he is the regimental RSM for the Jutland Dragoons.
Wow! So he's still serving.
Yeah, he is. He is.
What was your equipment like? I mean, you mentioned NBC training. So did you have a full NBC gear like the British Army or the US Army?
No, we didn't. One of the things that we found out later that the Danish Army NBC protection at the time I started was just the combat uniform, an NBC mask, and gloves, and that was supposed to protect us from chemical agents. I think the last exercise that our squadron did before we were discharged, I think it was March '88. We actually got issued with Noddy suits or NBC suits. I was not a part of that because I was sick at barracks at the time. I had the flu, but my buddies said that they were running around for the first time, and that was in '88. The Cold War was almost finished there. So the Danish Army gear in general we had some stuff that were good, but a lot of stuff we had it was not quite there. A lot of our webbing stuff was from Second World War, basically. It was so old. And webbing is perhaps not the best stuff to use because it has this bad thing that when it becomes wet, it kind of shrinks, which is rather nasty.
What was the composition of the Jutland Dragoons?
The Dragoons regiment were the primary armor regiment of the Danish Army at the time. They fielded 3 armor battalions and 1 reconnaissance battalion, which were the divisional reconnaissance battalion for the whole Jutland division, which were the main army part that was going to Germany in case of war. We had the Leopard 1 tank primarily, and then we had for infantry, we had M113 armor personnel carriers. But the interesting thing was that the Danish Army back then were actually combined arms. You had in each battalion of the Danish Army, you had both tanks and armored infantry and all the support features that you need for an army unit. And you also had old-fashioned, so to speak, motorized infantry, which back then in the Danish Army were actually infantry mounted on Mercedes Unimog trucks. So the Danish Army were quite unique back then because we were actually in peacetime organized as combined arms, or kind of like battle groups. As far as I know, none of the other NATO countries used that back then.
So you're in the 5th Battalion of the Jutland Dragoon Regiment. They're not using Leopards, though. You've got a lighter tank there, haven't you?
Yeah, back then the reconnaissance, like I said, in case of war, in case of a Soviet attack on Europe, the Jutland division, which were an armored infantry division, would be deployed to the north of Germany, around Lübeck, somewhere around there, and was supposed to kind of stop the Soviet Union going forward, which in our case would be mostly the Poles and Polish, I think two armored infantry Polish divisions. And later on, it was backed up by a Russian Guards division and some East German units. And we were the 5th Battalion of the Jutland Dragoons, were divisional reconnaissance. The Jutland Dragoon fielded the 3 maneuver brigades, and each of those would have a squadron deployed as their reconnaissance screen. And just to not go too deep into it, a Danish reconnaissance squadron is a kind of self-serving unit. They have their own supply and repair and headquarter platoon, where they also had a medical section and everything. They're supposed to operate alone behind enemy lines, basically. Each squadron has 3 reconnaissance platoon, and 1 reconnaissance platoon is made out of 2 scout groups mounted on Mercedes 240 Jeeps. They have 2 M41 light tanks, and they have 1 M113 with an infantry squad, which are called armor shooters because they were originally thought out to be infantry protecting the tanks, so to speak. And then they also have a M113 mounted 81 millimeter mortar. So that's how a reconnaissance platoon are organized. And just about the time when we were transferred to the squadron, they received the new updated M41s, where they had taken the old American M41 tanks and basically give them a really good overhaul, taking out the old gasoline engine, putting on I think it was from a Bradley, an American Bradley engine, and they had given it new Israeli fin-stabilized armor-piercing ammunition, and they had put in NBC system and also a thermal camera for night fighting. So at the time, it was actually the most sophisticated tank in the Danish Army.
Because the original ones were designed, I think, at the end of World War II, so they were quite an elderly design.
I think it saw service in Korea, right?
Yeah. In your infantry squad, did you have weapons like the Carl Gustaf as well in there?
A normal Danish infantry squad basically has, this is almost the same everywhere. We have the Heckler & Koch G3 rifle. We had the MG3 German-made light machine gun or general-purpose machine gun. And we had the Carl Gustaf, the Swedish 84mm anti-tank recoilless rifle. And then most squads, not the motorized infantry, but most other squads also had an American M2 heavy machine gun, which is a brilliant weapon if you let it be on the vehicle. Hauling it around is no fun and stuff like that. And then, of course, we also had M72 light anti-tank rockets and armor mines and all the usual stuff that you would have. The scouts were a little bit different. Each of these Mercedes 240, they had a gunner with a light machine gun, a general purpose machine gun. They had a driver, and then they have an observer. And I think 2 of the cars in this, each of the groups had a Carl Gustaf as well that they carried with them.
What did you think about your survivability if the war had started? Did you think about that?
Yeah. Not back then, but I've since heard stories about that. Well, basically something to the meaning of when a armored reconnaissance squadron drove out through the main gate, nobody really expected to hear from them again. So, and also when you look at the numbers back then, if you look at what kind of material, the numbers of tanks and everything that the Warsaw Pact had lined up against what we had, and I think, just so that people know what we're talking about, I think from about Hamburg and north were the Danes and the Germans' responsibility. There were the Jutland Division and also the 6th German Mechanized Division. And together with a couple of German local defense brigades, they were supposed to stop the northern gap and prevent the Soviet forces from penetrating up into Jutland. And when you look at the sheer numbers, let's just put it like this, then the odds were not in our favor.
Yeah. Along with quite a few units that were on that
exactly.
on that border. So what were your tactics going to be? Was it to shoot and scoot? So try and delay them, pull back to another position, and delay them. What were the tactics?
Mainly, I think if I think back, I think when we did our after the 3 months of recruit training were done, then we started to working together first as a squad and then as a platoon, and there we learned all the classic things about area reconnaissance, road reconnaissance, and a few other bits and bobs. But the thing that we did, as far as I can remember, for about 90% of the time, were delay action. As you say, scoot and shoot or shoot and scoot. Basically, wait until they're close, and then you hammer them with all you got, and then you pull back, and thus you trade terrain for time. Because the picture back then was that we had to delay the Soviet forces penetrating up into Jutland for as long as British and American reinforcements could arrive in Denmark and kind of put the big plug in, so to speak. When I have talked with comrades who was armored infantry or who were motorized infantry, and I cannot believe how many foxholes they dug. In the armored reconnaissance, digging foxholes was not one of those things that we did a lot of because we simply didn't have the time. So it was just, prepare a hasty firing position, getting ready, and then oops, there's the enemy, and then you hit them with everything you got. And then you just pull out. There's one more thing that I have to mention as well. We also did a little bit of like a bit of a hasty counterattack. If you have the enemy pulling up to you and you hit him very hard and you can see that they are hit, sometimes you can actually do and this is very small unit specific. Let's say if you have 2 Russian squads in position, sometimes we would actually do a mounted attack where my squad would be mounted on our M113. We would have both tanks in position and they would be covering us together with the scouts on the flanks. And then we would do a mounted attack where we would drive straight up into them. About 5 meters before, we would stop, dismount, and charge them. And of course, by then there should probably not be much left. I have never heard anybody else doing that as infantry or any kind of other positions. But I think it was because that the reconnaissance platoon is so strong that you can actually cover one squad with 2 tanks. I think that's also a thing that is quite unique about the reconnaissance.
So you must have done some major exercises as far as practicing that deployment. Can you take me through any of those?
Yeah, actually, I was extremely lucky, like I said, serving in a reconnaissance squadron because we were told pretty early on that when we come to the autumn of 1987, which was the year I started, we would go to Germany on an exercise. So we actually, beside doing the normal exercises back in Denmark, where we did both squadron exercises in civilian terrain, and also we had in the southwest of Jutland, we have a big exercise area called Oksbøl, where we did brigade size exercises. We also, of course, went there and fought with some of the other Danish regiments. But the thing that really kind of sticks out when we're talking about exercises is this exercise where we took the whole squadron, drove to the train yard in Holstebro, which is the garrison town where the Dragoon Regiment are based, put all our vehicles on trains, and then drove to Germany. We drove to the town of Neumünster in the north in Schleswig, and there we took the vehicles off the train, and then we deployed out into the exercise area. The exercise was called Brisk Frey 87, and was an exercise with German, Danish, English or British troops. And then we had, I think it was almost 2 weeks that we were down there. And then we ended the exercise with driving up to, I think it was Egon-Forde, I think it was. And then we actually got a ride home on German Navy landing craft. So they actually sailed us up to Denmark to the island of Fyn, where we disembarked on these landing craft, and then we drove back to our barracks.
So what was expected was going to be some sort of period of rising tension before war, where you would then move to your deployment positions.
Exactly. That was the plan, at least that's what they hoped for. We called it in Denmark, the grey phase, which is leading up to the war, where the whole, just about every military stuff in Jutland, and also Fyn. If you look at the map, we have Jutland, Fyn, and Sjælland. But Sjælland was another story. But all the Danish Army units or at least about 3/3 of them would deploy down to Germany as part of the Jutland division. And there, hopefully, we would have time to get down there, deploy, go out, and perhaps dig in and do all the stuff to be prepared, so prepared that we can be in case of an attack for the Warsaw Pact. And also back in Denmark, of course, all the kind of lower echelon reserve units would also be called up and would be deployed. And of course, the Home Guard would do, in the grey phase, they had some units that would actually deploy because they had, for example, they should guard different kinds of key elements, for example, mine depots and stuff like that.
Now, the term Home Guard conjures up the image of the British comedy series Dad's Army, about a platoon defending the British coast in 1940 when Nazi invasion threatened. What was the anticipated effectiveness of the Danish Home Guard?
I think there's actually stuff for a whole nother podcast just by talking about the Home Guard. But it's basically 74,000 people with arms. And back then, everybody had their weapon and ammunition in their own home. So a normal Home Guardsman would have a Heckler & Koch G3 and 100 of live rounds at his home. And when he was called on duty, it would take him, an hour or maybe half an hour, depending on where he lived. And he would be out there in full combat gear with ammunition in his weapon and ready to go to war. And no matter what you do, and there is also when you're talking about the Danish Home Guard in the 80s, and also before that, there are a certain Dad's Army aspect to it as well, that's for sure. I got lots of stories about that. But also the thing is, if you have 1.5% of the whole population who are under arms and who are out there, and they have the local knowledge, they know their area like their own backyard. And when you come as a invading force, having these 74,000 people running around almost everywhere would have been an absolute nightmare, that's for sure.
Yes, and I think a similar degree of effectiveness for the British Home Guard in the 1940s. I think due to Dad's Army, unfortunately, that formation has been unfairly maligned. Did you encounter any British troops on the exercises?
No, unfortunately not there on that exercise. I did later when I was a bit later in life. But we had a lot to do with the Germans, but not the British actually. I did hear that a couple of British lads were killed during the exercise, but I haven't been able to find any details on it. In my platoon, we had an accident where one of our mortar, M113, drove into a tree, doing 15 miles an hour or so. And actually people got pretty hurt. I know the mortar gunner he still, whenever the weather is about to change, he still feels it because he was standing at the back of the APC, and when it basically came to an abrupt halt, he fell forward and crashed his skull into the rim of the mortar pit, so to speak. So he actually fractured his skull. So that was quite intense, actually. But luckily, he survived.
How did you get on with the Germans? Because obviously some history there, as with us and the Germans as well. But just interested to understand how the relations were there.
Yeah, back then we absolutely liked the Germans. Absolutely, we were a bit envious of them because they had such great gear, but there were no animosity whatsoever. I think they were perhaps. I don't think they were as good soldiers as us, but I think you would probably always think that. So, but basically there were no animosity whatsoever. We were just good friends, basically.
It was ancient history by then.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm sure you've got some other stories there. Every veteran has stories. So, Bo,
yeah.
what have you got there for me?
Yeah, let's say we do have when I'm thinking about my whole service. When I go back to the time just after we were finished with basic training, and we were out doing the first, I think we were just getting taught how to work at squad level. I did a really stupid thing. We were out getting taught how to fight from a fixed dug-in position. And luckily, at the same time, I started in April of '87. They also drafted a whole mechanized infantry company. And I think the week or so before we had to go out and do this, they had been out, the whole company, and they had JBCs doing all their digging for them. So we kind of came out and kind of borrowed their positions. So we were doing all the stuff that you do when you make a dug-in fortified position. I was out. For example, you do barbed wire at 200 meters and 400 meters, and in front of each row of 321 of NATO barbed wire, you lay a whole line of anti-armor mines. And I was standing there working with the barbed wire, and then I had my rifle slung over my shoulder. And it was giving me trouble working with the barbed wire because NATO barbed wire can be really troublesome. I just said with my rifle, okay, I'll just put it down on the ground here. So, and then the APC, our squad APC, the M113, came driving by about, let's say, half a meter from me or so, and they were chucking out the landmines from the back of it. That's how we lay landmines back then. But what I forgot to pick up the rifle before the APC drove over it. So my rifle actually got run over by our squad M113, which is not good because the Heckler & Koch G3 is a very good rifle, sturdy and pretty reliable. But getting run over by a M113, not so much. So kind of the frame was bent. And then the guys in the APC, they drove up to our platoon commander because his background when he was a conscript sergeant he was mechanized infantry. So he was the one actually he was the teacher for my squad, the armor shooter squad. And he was standing there, and then they said, I also had to add another thing. When you are a conscript in the Dragoons, you don't use surnames. You, of course, don't use first name, of course. But in the Dragoons, you have a city name, which is also a very old tradition from back in the days when it was cavalry, where you came to a village, said Viborg, and then you would take the guy called Viborg and put him up front because he had the local knowledge. This, of course, is not used anymore as such, but the tradition of using city names are still in use by the regiment to this day. So, of course, I was from the city called Brabrand. So they drove up and said, we actually we drove over Brabrand's rifle. And then he just made this big puzzle and said, well, how about Brabrand? Did you drive over him as well? And that kind of became platoon legend. And actually, I was in big trouble because I was the moron who put my rifle down for a moment and then let the APC drive over it. But I think I got out of trouble because they said, we'll make it out as it was actually the M113 who did the damage. So they kind of swept it under the rug, I think. So I didn't get punished. I just got a new rifle. I think I actually deserved maybe just a little bit of punishment because it was rather stupid.
That's interesting, you talking about the city names there, because you sent me a photo of your platoon, I think it was, and I was trying to find you on there, and I was getting really confused because I couldn't see your last name on there, and that's obviously why, because I could see repeats of the same last name, or what I thought was the last name, and I was thinking, this is a bit strange, and now it completely makes sense.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that, of course. Of course, our sergeants and platoon commander, they, of course, use their normal surnames. And also in the Danish Army, as soon as you get a contract, when you're done with your conscription and start, in the Danish Army, we don't have, like I said, if you want to become an NCO, you have to apply for sergeant school. If you don't do that, you just kind of become what we in Denmark call a constable, if you translate it directly to English. But constable, we have them as constable and constable second grade and constable first grade, I think. And it's basically just a name for a professional soldier. And these constable grades are actually more a pay grade, so to speak. But if you become a constable, you of course also use your surname. The city names is only for conscripts. We had one exercise I remember quite clearly where we were thundering ahead out in the terrain, and then we had to drive over this kind of narrow place, and we were driving all hell bent for leather, and we had one of the scouts just behind us. I think it was in Denmark. If you put two squads together, they become a section, as we call it in Denmark. So we had the section commander of the scouts. That's the guy who was in charge of all the scouts in the platoon. He was right behind us. So suddenly we were driving like hell, and our vehicle commander saw that there were landmines on cross of this small dike that we were driving on. And he called a halt. And then actually, without looking back that he is supposed to do, he just said, reverse, reverse, reverse. And the driver just put it in reverse and started to reverse. He failed to watch that the section commander was right behind in his Mercedes 240. And even though we were standing in the hatch behind him and yelling and shouting, he had his crew helmet on, so he couldn't hear anything. So we actually just kind of whacked into the section commander's Mercedes 240. And then the section commander's call sign is 1 on the radio net, and as the armor shooters are 8. And the platoon commander is called 5 in the Danish Army. So you could hear on the radio, and he called up and said, 5, this is 1. We just been clobbered by 8. And then you can hear, what? He was not impressed. And I actually think I'm pretty sure that our vehicle commander, he actually got fined. And I think the driver of the section commander's Jeep also got a fine because he was too close. So that later became a platoon legend.
I can imagine, as you said earlier, your unit has quite a history, and in the British Army, there's there used to be quite a lot of emphasis on teaching recruits about the regimental history and how important the battle honours are and things like that. Was that part of the ethos of being in the Jutland Dragoons?
Yeah, there were not as much as recruits, so to speak. There were some telling about. There were a famous dragoon called from the 1864 war with Germany, where he was. I think he was on one of the pictures I sent you, where he was called Niels Kelsen, and he was a dragoon that during some of the skirmishes with German hussars were cut off from his unit, and he was 1 against 10, and they wanted him to surrender, and he refused, and he was pretty good at defending himself. So basically, it ended up with one of the German officers went behind him and took out his pistol and killed him, basically. He's been, of course, we were told about him. We were also told about in 1849, where the first Schleswig War between Germany and Denmark, and the one in 1864 is called the Second War of Schleswig. And in the first war in 1849, what later became the Jutland Dragoons had a skirmish with the German hussars, actually in my hometown of Aarhus, where they just basically just thrashed them like, I don't know, they really kicked them so they wouldn't believe it. Stuff like that were, of course, talked a lot about, but also there were back then in the Danish Army a kind of a, what do you call it, a reconnaissance spirit or something like that. For example, when we went to Germany during British Fray, my platoon didn't have any tank crews because back then tank crews were professional soldiers. So in order to our platoon to function like a normal reconnaissance squadron, we actually borrowed 2 tank crews from the guys over at Bornholm. Bornholm is this very little Danish island out in the middle of the Baltic, south of Sweden actually. And they had, of course, their own kind of brigade-size defensive unit. And among them, they also had a reconnaissance squadron. So we borrowed some of these guys, and we really enjoyed them. Back then, we referred to the guys from Bornholm's Værn as the herring militia, because Bornholm was very, very well known for their smoked herring. So we kind of joked a little bit and called them the herring militia. We had some fun with that. But these guys, they were really good at camouflaging their tanks. Normally, when we were doing exercises in civilian territory or civilian terrain, we would basically, try and find a small patch of spruce trees and then cut down what we needed, and then we would camouflage our vehicles with it. These guys from Bornholm, they actually pulled up to a private German house, went inside with the chainsaw and cut down one of the spruce trees and camouflaged the tank in no time. And I remember our platoon leader's driver, he said that me and the platoon leader, we were just sitting there with open mouths and just looking at them, because going into people's homes back then were into people's private areas, so to speak, or people's private gardens. That was a kind of a no-no. So it's also become platoon legend that the guys from Bornholm, they were pretty adept into camouflaging their vehicles. Later on, up into the 90s, when the reconnaissance unit traded out their M41s and got Leopard 1 tanks in the reconnaissance as well, they got them directly refurbished from Germany, and a lot of them were kind of the surface was pretty slick. So one day, this is a story from one of the sergeants in my platoon who later became a tanker. He had one of these guys who fell off the tank and broke his arm, I think. So they said, maybe we should repaint them and maybe throw on some sand in order so kind of a anti-slip surface. And while they were doing that, they were thinking, wouldn't it look cool if we kind of overpainted the green? Because all Danish vehicles were painted a bit like the British Army. A olive green kind of color and black, basically. Very close to the British Army. So they said, wouldn't this be nice if we painted over the green so the tank is completely black? Because they had an idea that this was actually work better when it was out in the field. And as said, so was done. And the day after, when the squadron commander came by, he was furious and he was scolding them and giving them hell, because in Denmark, it's kind of, you have to abide by the rules. You have to follow the instruction manual and all kinds of stuff like that. And he was very upset about this. So he said to them, and this was, I think it was a Friday morning actually, where he scolded them and said, from Monday, nobody is painting any tanks in this squadron. And they of course said yes. And then he went away. And after he was gone, they said, well, he did actually say Monday. So maybe we should just paint the other tanks in the squadron right away. So they did. And on Monday, when the squadron commander came back, the first thing he did was he ran into the battalion commander. And the battalion commander said, "Oh, I just seen your tanks. Damn, that looks cool. They are really awesome." And then suddenly it was a very good idea that they started to paint the tanks black. And actually, from what we hear, is it works very well when the tank is, especially in the Danish terrain and the terrain in north of Germany where we were supposed to fight, a black painted tank, especially in the evening and in the morning, if it's if it got a good background, it will totally disappear. And people would say, "Isn't that cheating?" No, it's reconnaissance.
Yeah, I guess, if you're in shadow and stuff like that.
When I saw it, the first time I saw it was a reunion day at the barrack, and I was thinking, why the hell did they paint it black? And then his name was the sergeant in question. I think there's no trouble in mentioning him. His name was Søren Dyrby, and he was also a scout and a tanker from the Will of God, and he was very good. And he said to me that it works really well when we are out, especially in the evening and the morning. The tank just about disappears. Another one, but this is not actually from my unit, but the people we talked about from Bornholm, they also had a light tank squadron back then, equipped with M41 tanks. And the present, I think he was recently the commander of the Royal Guard. He was back in the days. I think he started out as a tank platoon commander, and then he became 2IC of the tank squadron. And this was around late 1970s, 1980. And before that, all Danish vehicles were just painted green, just this military green. And then around 1980 came an instruction to paint them green and black, just like we see on British Army vehicles from back then. And he said he also told that in this tank squadron on Bornholm, there were the same spirit. Very high-spirited, very professional people who really know what they're doing. And he had a talk with some of the senior sergeants, and of course his 2IC and all that in the squadron about how they should paint these tanks. And they had a lot of good ideas. But he said, I think he had moved from 2IC to Squadron OC at this time. He said, I hear what you're saying. They're good ideas. And as far as I'm concerned, you could paint them pink. But for now, we'll just paint them according to Army regulations. And that was done, of course. And then about a year and maybe 2 years later, he was relieved of command because he had to go to staff school. And on his last day in the squadron, it was a tradition that you would be picked up at your own home by somebody from the squadron and driven to the squadron area where you would have breakfast, and you would have some kind of celebration and a small change of command parade and stuff like that. But of course, he was picked up at his home by an M41 tank that was painted pink. I have a picture of it. It's not the best paint job, but it's pink.
Brilliant.
So I think that's also in the kind of spirit that we are talking about here, which I think is very funny. So I will see if I can find the picture and put it up on the Facebook page.
Yeah, and I'll include that in the episode notes as well. Now, in a lot of armies, you've got rivalry between different units. I'm thinking that there must be the same in the Danish Army with the Dragoons and I don't know some of your other units that have quite a history.
Exactly. In the Danish Army, it's basically even inside the platoon, especially maybe I think most units have this. In our platoon, we would pick on the mortars, and the scouts would pick on us. But if anybody from the outside would hassle any of our guys, then suddenly we would become one unit. We would also hassle the guys from the mechanized infantry company, and they would hassle us. And of course, when you go out and look at regimental units, then of course there could be really bad blood. In the town of Viborg, which is kind of close to Holstebro, where I was stationed, there were an infantry regiment called the Prince Life Regiment. It was a normal infantry regiment which fielded, I think back then they fielded at least 2 armored infantry battalions. And I know that on exercises in the late 70s and 80s, they were actually fist fights, and there were actually scenarios where people who got taken prisoner were actually subjected to different kinds of if you did it today, you'll probably go into jail. There were something getting close to water torture and stuff like that. There were some really unpleasant things going on back then. By the time I was in the army, this has kind of subsided. Maybe some wise people had said to them, cut it out. But of course, there was still the kind of harmless bantering. Everybody in Denmark, everybody in the army in Denmark, they kind of hassled the lifeguard, because the lifeguard, they spent, out of their 12 months, they spent 4 months doing ceremonial duties, meaning, in our opinion, that they are not as good soldiers as we are, because they spent so much time polishing boots and brass and all kinds of stuff. And also, for example, the regiment I talked about earlier, the Prince Life Regiment, their beret badge is a wild boar. So we teased them about that, calling them the Pig Central and whatever, and they would call us dinos. And dinos is short for dinosaurs, meaning dinosaurs has too much armor, too little brain. So, but all that stuff were pretty harmless and all in good spirit and fun. Stuff like that was going on, but I haven't met any kind of serious animosity. And I must admit, later on in life, I actually gotten to know quite a few who were in the lifeguard. And I must admit, the way they are taught and the way they do things kind of makes sense in order to what they're doing later on. Maybe that's material for another podcast. I don't know. They're really motivated. The lifeguard guys are really motivated because they have to stand together because they get so much crap and so much from their officers and their NCOs. So it's kind of a forging effect that they have. So I kind of not admire them, but I think that they're okay.
And the lifeguards is like, are they sort of like guarding the Royal Palace in Copenhagen and stuff like that? Is that part of their role?
Yeah, it's just like the Guards Division in the UK, where they take care of the Queen, stand on guarding her castle and stuff like that. And it also meant that there were some type of units that the lifeguard did not make, because there was some type of, I can't remember. I'm not sure. There was some of the units, they did not have the time to train properly, because you cannot train people in certain roles if you only have 8 months of service. But then, in the other hand, I think, for example, Denmark used to, in the 50s and 60s, we used to have this American caliber 50 quad gun mounts that were used during the Second World War and was basically phased out all around in the Danish army. But the lifeguard, they were still making platoons or anti-aircraft sections in their headquarters and support companies back then in the 80s. And I have recently found out why, because some of the very low prioritized reserve battalions, they had there were a civilian airport on Sjælland, and one of their jobs was to guard that, and using Mercedes trucks with one of these quad caliber 50 on the back is a very good way of defending a airport from, let's say, helicopters. There's actually one more thing that I actually would like to touch. The first squadron, reconnaissance squadron that I was a part of, in a reconnaissance squadron, there is also a kind of performance culture. You really have to perform. And I think the squadron that I was in was blessed. We had the most amazing squadron commander, Major Grünberger. We had some very good platoon commanders beside my platoon commander. The other two, one of them, which he is now Brigadier Lyne, and he is the second in command of the whole Danish Army. So he also kind of went far. He, for example, at one time, I can't remember when, I think it was in late autumn of 87, he actually planned a patrolling exercise where you simulate that you are behind enemy lines, you have lost your vehicles, you're on foot, and you're doing basically, escape and survival, and also doing combat jobs. He planned that for the whole squadron, everybody in the squadron. It was only him and two other guys that were his helpers who were not a part. So the evening that we left barracks, I saw our squadron commander, our 2IC, and our operations officer in the squadron, everybody in combat uniforms, backpacks, their own weapon, woolly hats, camouflage cream, mounting the trucks, being driven out to where the exercise was supposed to start. And I think that is, in the Danish Army, my recollection, there are two kind of officers. There are the ones who say, go that way, forward, and attack. And then there are the other kind, which we had most of in my squadron, if not all, who said, follow me. It's a picture of the whole thing, but because if a reconnaissance squadron commander go out and say, follow me, something is wrong. But kind of this exercise where the squadron commander came out with his 2IC, his operations officer, and everybody, also the one sitting behind the desk every day, everybody was out, cam cream, weapons, and backpack. And then I think it took a whole week where we walked a lot, and we did patrolling and ambushes and stuff like that. And then the exercise culminated that we went to Aalborg, where the Danish Special Forces, the Jaeger Corps, are based, and they have this kind of training tower where you can practice jumping in parachute. So we got the reward of doing a jump from their tower. And this is just one of the things that I'll never forget. This whole trip with everything that we did, it was a great experience, and especially this kind of command lesson that there is here with the squadron commander and all these people is out there with the guys as well.
Yeah.
So that was a brilliant thing.
Was that your only escape and evasion training that you had?
Yeah. Beside that, we didn't have anything. Normal SEER training, we didn't do that. We were, of course, told what was expected from us. If you were captured, only name, rank, and number, and that was it. But this was pretty close. We also, when we were operating, I think basically the whole squadron was actually turned on the head, and everybody was organized into small 4-man patrols. And I think I was like in the armor shooters, so I was put on the crew with one of the scout cars and worked with them during the whole session. And we also, during this exercise, we also had a Hunter force out there. I think it was the headquarter and support company from the 1st Battalion that were out there hunting us. And we also had a lot of the stuff we did was against the Home Guard. And they are pretty amazing to fight against because they are everywhere. You cannot move, and there they are because they have the local knowledge. So it was a very good exercise, and so we sometimes we felt the pressure, so to speak.
I've come across other units, like some of the US tank units don't appear to have been trained in escape and evasion. Some British tank units were. But interesting to hear your experiences there.
As far as I can figure out, when you go into the professional part of the army, all the tank squadrons and, for example, a lot of the staff and headquarter support companies, they were back then also professional soldiers. And for them, it was kind of normal that about every 2 years, every 3 years, their unit would make such a it is basically an escape and evasion exercise where they would be out, no vehicles, on foot, getting hunted, and just what they could carry on their backs. The conscript units, not all of them. I think a few of them got this experience, but not all of them. I have one more thing, if we have time for it. I've written here what we thought we knew and what actually was true. One of the more sombering things was that, for example, we were told when they upgraded the Danish M41, we were told that we bought this new armor-piercing discarding sabot fin-stabilized round for its 76mm gun, and we were told back then that it was able to penetrate all known Warsaw Pact armor. And that's one of the things that we said, wow, that's impressive. So you'll just shoot everything the Russians have to hell. For example, at the time, most of the Polish units that we were supposed to fight against, most of them had T-55, which is an old tank. A few of them had T-72. The Russian Guards Armor Division that we were supposed to, it was 94th, I think it was called, they had, for example, the T-80. After the Cold War, it was actually figured out that there were the Danish Army intelligence. They got their hands on a export version of the T-72, and they did some test firing with the Leopard 1, the 105mm, doing with the finest or the hardest hitting round they have, which is also an armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot round. And actually, they were not able to penetrate the front part of the turret on the T-72, which is kind of that would have been a very nasty surprise back then. I think, of course, they then found out that as long as they just aim low, then the round can hit the T-72 at the front, go all the way through the tank and through the engine and out the back. But the front part of the turret, they cannot penetrate that, which also is kind of, we were taught to shoot with our Carl Gustavs straight at them at the front, which I'm pretty sure would have very little effect. So that they are kind of things that we figured out later on. For example, the attack plans on Denmark, we were told that I think Denmark was supposed to have something up until about 100 small tactical nukes and 2 big nukes. It's one of the things where you think, well, if they did that, then the battle would be over pretty quick. But I myself very much doubt that they would use nuclear weapons because then it would just very quickly go into a tit for tat thing, and then we would basically have a nuclear holocaust. And I think also the stuff about NBC equipment, that we basically up until 88 just had our uniforms. And as far as I know, the agents that the Russians were or the Soviets were using would penetrate through clothes and through the skin. So it wouldn't really do us much good. And this is one of the things that I think could really be a problem. I would like to dedicate this podcast to my platoon. I am very proud to have served with you, and of course to everybody who ever served in the 1st Reconnaissance Squadron. Thank you very much.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.